Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those of you who are in Russia. Welcome to this joint event organized by the New York Russia Public Policy Forum, co-hosted by the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, the New York University Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia, and PONARS-Eurasia, an initiative of the George Washington University funded by Carnegie Corporation of New York. We are here to discuss US-Russia relations after the US election. What can we expect? And of course, we knew when we decided for the day that we could find ourselves in the situation of not having exactly the results, which is the case. At the same time, I think we have a more or less clear picture on how that will be ending probably very soon. So once again, welcome to this joint seminar, and I will now give the floor to Joshua Tucker.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Marlene. Good morning to everyone who's joining us on the East Coast. Good morning. Many of you may be in the United States, and for any of you who are coming in from even earlier in the rest of the United States, we're extremely happy to have you here. Good afternoon to everyone who's in Europe. I guess it's still afternoon in Russia as well, so we're thrilled to have all of you here. My name is Joshua Tucker. I'm the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia here at NYU. And this is an event that we run somewhat regularly with the Harriman Institute at Columbia that we call our New York City Russia Public Policy Series, where we are periodically bringing together collections of academic and non-academic experts to talk about issues that have great implications for understanding Russia in the contemporary era, but in particular for application of academic research and understanding and expertise to issues related to policy issues, many of which involve domestic politics within Russia and the region, others which involve obviously foreign policy and relations today. So we're super, super excited to be able to have all of you here today to talk about the implications of the recent US elections, which I'm not saying concluded US elections, ongoing US elections, but soon to be concluded US elections, which will either way they turn out right now, but especially the way they look like they're turning out right now, opens up opportunities for new relations between, or for new directions or new questions to be asked about the United States' relations with Russia and the United States' relation with and Russian relations with the US and US in the post-Soviet world. We want to thank, before we begin, the Carnegie Foundation, which has generously provided funding to support this seminar series. We are extremely grateful to be co-sponsoring this with PONARS, and we're very, very happy to have all of you here today with us. So I'm going to pass it over to Alex Cooley from the Harriman Institute, who is always we co-chair all of these New York City Russia Public Policy Series together, and he is going to be introducing our amazing collection of panelists who will be here to speak on this incredibly important topic. So good morning, good afternoon, great to see all of you here. Alex?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over people's bios. We will paste them in the chat. We have 5 speakers today, so we've asked each speaker to give us about 8 minutes of their time. At about 7 minutes, I'll raise my hand just as an indicator. I would encourage everyone in the audience, if you have a question, please use the question and answer feature on Zoom, or if you're watching on YouTube, type your question and it'll come to us. So these 5 experts have all, I think, professionally committed themselves to fostering some sort of US-Russia understanding on both sides. And so this is really a wonderful opportunity to hear from them, not only about where they think US-Russia relations are going forward, what the salient issues are, but also how is this election played into perceptions of US-Russia relations, as well as in the domestic environments of each country. So first, let's go to Dr. Samuel Greene, who is a reader in Russian politics and director of the Russia Institute at King's College London. Sam, welcome.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Josh, Marlene, and Alex for the opportunity and for the invitation. I don't know how unexpected it was that we were going to end up here. I think we probably knew that it was going to take a while to count the vote. And in the end, I think we are pointing to the outcome that we all more or less expected, probably, or at least that Nate Silver told us we should expect. And so, you know, we are in a place that hopefully intellectually we've kind of prepared for, and yet I think finding an answer to this question in terms of what changes, does this change the U.S.-Russia relationship? What are things going to look like going forward? Is still pretty complicated. The good news for me is that because I go first, I get to say all the really obvious things, and everybody else can fill in with the more sort of heavy intellectual lifting. I mean, the short answer to the question, is the U.S.-Russia relationship going to change, is no. And the long answer is also probably no. I can run through a couple of thoughts. First of all, one of the things that's I think remarkable is that Russia was really not present in this election. Right, it wasn't present in the conversation around the election. This was not fought over Russia, right? There has not been much of a conversation about Russian interference, despite the fact that in the lead up to the election there was, right. So there was conversation about, do we need to secure our election infrastructure and the media and the discourse, right, against interference, and yet during the campaign we didn't hear much of that. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is that there may have been less of it, right? And if we look back and compare what has happened in this cycle to what happened in 2016, we'll get the fuller analysis probably to a large extent with Josh's help later down the road, right? But my initial impression is that there has been less to talk about. But there were a lot of other things to talk about as well, right? It's hard to focus on Russia if what's going on is recession and COVID-19 and all the other stuff that's happening in American life, right? To a large extent, I think importantly, and maybe somewhat unexpectedly, this was really not an election that was as much about Russia as we would have expected. And broadly, if we're interested in the U.S.-Russia relationship, I take that as good news, right? There are a couple of other points of good news. I think, one is that, Biden is an adult, right? I think that we have heard a lot of things about, the potential for, the Democratic administration, particularly a Democratic administration with ties to the Obama administration and with friendly relations with Hillary Clinton, right, might come in with a sense of wanting to seek revenge. And there might be a little bit of that going on in the background. But, Biden brings with him, I think, a less emotional approach to politics, certainly than the Trump administration had, and more of a professional approach. So I would expect the restoration of expertise into the relationship in Washington, and thus the ability to at least refocus on sort of the strategic elements of the relationship and the sort of the strategic infrastructure of the relationship, right? So the potential, at least, for a return in particular to discussions on arms control, for which I think Moscow certainly is open, and for which I think they will find a willing partner in this administration. More importantly than a willing partner, I think they find a capable partner in an incoming Biden administration that will bring with it people who have at least some memory of having negotiated these sorts of agreements before, right? And a professional commitment to seeing that work. I think the other piece of good news is probably that attitudes in Moscow have shifted, right? We did not see even the domestic political conversation in Russia, the media conversation, really focus on these elections in the way that they focused on 2016. I mean, Russians and Russian media always focus and fixate on American elections to a degree that's probably unhealthy. And they did that again this time, right? But without sort of picking sides to the degree that they had before, and without the amount of, again, emotion that we saw in 2016, right? So the ground at least is prepared for, the necessity of working with the Biden administration, the Democratic administration. But I think more broadly, Russia operates on the international scene to a certain extent by manufacturing and manipulating uncertainty. It's something I talk about a lot. But this idea that Moscow not being sort of institutionally strong and conventionally strong profits by keeping other people off balance and keeping people guessing as to what Moscow's intentions are. That means that Moscow is taking risks on a regular basis. But in order to take those risks and calculate those risks, it is easier when you can hold other variables relatively constant, right? And it found a supremely unconstant variable in the Trump administration, right? So the idea that you might now have a predictable administration in Washington, one that plays by certain rules, right? I think is one that Moscow will find useful and maybe make it easier to do business. On the other hand, right, I think that there will be a deeper lesson that they have learned, right, which is that you may have to, and this is a lesson that Europe is learning as well, right, you may have to, for a long time to come, expect further unpredictability from American politics, right, that we have a Biden administration now, we do not know what's going to happen 4 years down the road, right, we could be dealing with an unpredictable US, maybe with periods of predictability for some time to come, right. Broadly, that's the good news. The bad news, a lot of it is on the U.S. Front. I'll start maybe with the bad news on the Russian front, which is not new news, right? I mean, conflict has become baked into the Russian political system, right, for quite some time now. You know, we could go back as far, I would trace it back to sort of 2011, 2012, when part of the wedge that they started using in Moscow against the Bolotnaya opposition, right, was to push back against the West, right, was to frame Russian politics in terms of conflict with the West, and that, even though it's not as powerful as it used to be, remains an important part of the legitimacy equation for Putin. And given how much more tenuous that equation has become for Putin in recent months and years, I think it's very unlikely that they're going to want to unpick that by all of a sudden pivoting to a more friendly, constructive relationship with the West. Sanctions are also baked into Russian politics, including mass politics and elite politics. And again, I think that despite all the noise about wanting to come out from under sanctions and a genuine desire not to have more sanctions, I don't see any behavior or rhetoric that would suggest that they're willing to actually take the pain domestically, politically, that would come with undoing sanctions. So again, I think they're fairly happy with that aspect of the relationship. The rest of the bad news is on the Washington side, and I'll go through this as quickly as I can. Some of this, again, is not new, right? Sanctions are congressional. We know that. We know it's going to be very difficult to unpack them. And I think even though Moscow wasn't really prominent in this election, it's still hard to see any sort of political capital to be gained in Washington by pressing for an unpicking of the congressional sanctions regime. I think we can also expect the Republicans, who will probably maintain control of the Senate, right, to press Biden on a number of fronts to really hobble his administration. One of those fronts will almost certainly be Ukraine and Burisma as a good way of going after Hunter Biden and Biden more generally, which will not only make it more difficult for Biden to do anything concerted on the Ukraine front, right, but it will really complicate any further conversations about Russia and the post-Soviet space more broadly. I think Biden is likely to find himself preoccupied with those sorts of investigations, which again is going to make it very difficult to focus on anything strategic. So unfortunately, even with a very different White House, I think we are likely to see much more of the same, and I will stop there.
Sam, thanks so much for covering that sweeping territory between the two sides and internally. Next, I'd like to turn to our speaker currently in Moscow, Dr. Victoria Zhuravleva, who's head of the Center for North American Studies at the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations, or as we know it for short, IMMO. Victoria, good afternoon. What's the view like there, both from your perspective in Russia, but also as a specialist in North American politics yourself?
Thank you, Alex, and thank you all for this opportunity. And I think it's a great time for us to start to think about our future and our relationship. I think that I agree with Sam. One good news is these elections were much less emotional for Russia, and Russia was not in the focus of this election, so it's very great for Russia. Very good news. But at the same time, it was still these elections were still in focus in Russia. Very funny thing, we have a lot of different social, I mean, studies among Russian who would be great who would be better for Russia, Trump or Biden. And what is very surprised for me, that there were no one who even doesn't know who is Trump or who is Biden, and there were no one who would ask, why should I think about it? Everyone had his own opinion on American elections. It's very funny, and it's at the same time it's very, I would say, it's a picture of Russian-American relations. It's very for Russia, it is very important. Everything what is going on in United States, it's some piece of Russian life. Some very important piece of Russian lives. So United States are always in focus in Russia. The same with these elections. As for expectations, I would say that they are more pessimistic, and I would say there is an understanding in Russia that for now, neither Biden nor Trump are not good for Russia. It means that there would be no any changes in Russian-American relations, both with Biden or Trump, because there is some strategic lines in American foreign policy, American Russian policy, and they won't be changed with Biden. Anyway, in some near future, we will stay in these lines, in this sanction life, sanction reality of Russian-American relations. And the second thing, I personally, as an expert on Russian-American relations, I think that there are two fundamental things that are systematic to Russian-American relations, and that won't change anyway with Biden, with change of administration, and that's why it make me pessimistic about the future of our relations. First of all, it's it's a question of different global missions with competitive ambitions. Both the United States and Russia perceive themselves as global power and a leader, no matter how far Russia today from this self-perception, and how hard it is for the United States to hold to their leader role. No matter how these self-perceptions are perceived by the other side, both for Russia and the United States, leadership is a major part of their identity. In fact, I think that both Russia and the United States have the idea of greatness, of national exceptionalism in the core of its identities. And the messianic idea is translated into various foreign policy conceptions of leadership, but in the core of its there is a unique mission of the savior, both for Russia and for the United States. So it means that there are rivals here, and this rivalry won't stop with the change of the administration. And the second thing that I think is I would be a spoiler here, because it's not a good thing to say it, and it's not often that we hear it. But I think it's as we are experts here, we should say the truth. And the truth, to my mind, is that in the core of any relations, there is a balance between gains and losses, both political and economic. And the problem is that political gains from the conflict relationships that we have between Russia and the United States are much bigger, both for Russia and for the United States, than any losses. And the balance here is the intensity of the conflict. It should be scaring enough, but not devastating. To be on the brink, it is just a perfect balance for our bilateral relations, unfortunately. It is where we are here. Maybe today we are too much, but it is pretty close. And it is a matter of political profit. The model of our relations was born during the Cold War, and it has a very important element in itself. It is an image of external enemy, which plays important role in domestic policy. And after the Cold War, it is turned out that this element is irreplaceable and still very needed. And at the same time, we have, as we know, no economic interdependence, which would restrain both countries from taking too risky steps and would make them more open to compromises. And it means a perfect balance, no economic losses, but important political gains. So the question is, why changing this model if it fits perfectly well to domestic logic of both countries? I understand that it should be sounds political incorrect, and really we don't speak much about it, but I think that the things are like this, and we are not politicians, we are experts, so why we should have our eyes open in this situation. So the problem is that cyclical conflict nature doesn't imply neither stable partnership nor friendly relations. And to come out from this vicious circle, it's necessary to change the model of relations with all its elements, even with this one. And the last problem is that Russia and the United States have very limited experience of cooperative relations. We are trapped in these mutual accusations and distrust, and it's very hard to see another reality. But I think that today we have a good opportunity because of this current global crisis with COVID, which reveals that the world needs the responsible dialogue of all the parts, all the countries, to move on, because the world is changing and we should change ourselves also. So I think it's high time for us to think what kind of relations we would like to have, and what we need to change them, and what could be the ways to change them. The problem is that we can speak about it a lot, being an expert on our it's 1 second, but they are not changing on the level of the experts, unfortunately, because they're changing on the level of politicians. But for us, it's a good opportunity to create something for them, for politicians, maybe to propose them something. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for also covering the systemic differences, but also reminding us the very real domestic context in both countries and the incentives for this kind of hot contested relationship that we have. So staying in the same time zone, I'd say we go now to Andrei Kortunov, who is Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council of RIAC, and who also regularly participates in these types of dialogues. Andrei, what's your view, not only of what's just happened or happening in the election, but where things are going from here? And Andrei, I think you're on mute, so, yep.
Here I am. Can you hear me? If I have a nice quote and I don't have the author of the quote, I usually attribute the quote to Mark Twain. So Mark Twain once said that the Wagner music is not as bad as it sounds. I think that we can probably expect that the Russia policy of President Biden will not be as hard as we can judge from his election rhetoric. And let me try to make a case about what we can expect in the nearest future. First of all, it's clear that foreign policy problems will be put on a back burner by the Biden administration simply because the administration has too many domestic issues to take care of. So we cannot expect an early start in the US foreign policy. I think for some time it will be reactive rather than proactive. It's likely to be situational rather than strategic. And the administration might find even difficulties in putting together its team. Of course, given the nature of the administration, given the style of President Biden, he's more likely to delegate than his predecessor was. And it means that a lot will depend on who is going to be Secretary of State, who will lead Pentagon, who will be presidential assistant on national security, and things like that. Indeed, it matters a lot whether we see someone like Susan Rice or Bill Burns sitting in the foggy bottom. My second observation is that even when the Biden administration is ready to approach foreign policy in a serious way, Russia is not likely to be on top of its priority list. Because I think that the first tier problems are the transatlantic relations, how to repair this very damaged but also very important relationship. And second, of course, competition with China. I think that the Biden administration will be focused on how to get back to the drawing board and how to have a trade agreement with the People's Republic of China. So having said that, I think that we can still expect some changes in the US approach towards Russia. And I think that there are positive changes and there are likely to be negative changes. Let me start with the negative side. Definitely, Biden is not likely to praise Mr. Putin like Donald Trump did. He will be very critical of the Russian president. And I think that though he's a very diplomatic person, but he will not hide his attitude towards the Russian president. There is no chemistry between Biden and Putin. And we know that it would be very difficult, for example, to put together a US-Russian summit. It will not happen anytime soon. I think maximum that we can expect is a meeting on the side, on the margins of some multilateral event, either next year or maybe later in 2022. Second, of course, the Biden administration will put much more emphasis on the human rights problem, like Democrats usually do. And we can see, for example, a new Navalny list of sanctions or a more active application of the Magnitsky list. This is likely to be, that might happen pretty soon. And of course, the administration will be supported on the Hill. Finally, I think that we can say that the Biden administration will be in a position to challenge Russia in the so-called near abroad. I can imagine a more active US policy, for example, in Belarus, and also a more consistent support of Ukraine. Though, of course, we should mention that Trump didn't abandon Ukraine completely, though his rhetoric might suggest that he did. On the positive side, however, I think that Biden can restore more or less normal diplomatic relations with Russia, which would be nice, because definitely our embassies are now decapitated and they look like besieged fortresses, respectively in Moscow and in Washington. I think Biden might take a more reasonable approach to the diplomatic relationship because he understands the importance of this relationship. Second, I think that definitely under Biden administration, we might see some attempts to repair the US-Russian strategic arms control. Again, it will not bring this control back as the axis of the international security system. But I think that it is possible that Biden will try to get back to the New START agreement and even to start new negotiations with Moscow on strategic stability. But these new negotiations are likely to be very tough because it's clear that the Biden administration, like the Trump administration, will try to engage the People's Republic of China, which will be extremely difficult. And it will also try to bring Russian tactical nukes in Europe to the table, which will be hard to swallow for Moscow. So I think we can expect some moderate progress. We can see more contacts between the military, but we are not likely to see any breakthroughs in the strategic field. Now, I think that there are some modest opportunities in regional issues, especially if the Biden administration takes a more balanced approach to Iran. And if it can bring the United States back to JCPOA, I think it will definitely face a very serious opposition on the Hill, especially in the Republican Senate. But again, you know, this is something that they can do if they act fast. Definitely, it will open some avenues for more situational cooperation on Syria, though, again, we should not overestimate opportunities there. And I can talk about that in more detail, but I think that the Biden administration can also... Am I already running out of my time? That's what you're...
1 minute left, yeah.
Oh, wow, yeah. So, no, okay, then let me limit myself to just one point, and this point is sanctions. In Moscow, many are concerned about the Biden administration bringing sanctions to a new level. And, you know, Biden mentioned it a couple of times during the campaign that in his view, Trump was too soft on sanctions, and when Biden is in the White House, he would do something really hard. Something devastating for Putin and for the Russian economy. I think that definitely sanctions will be there, but frankly, I'm a little bit skeptical about the ability of the Biden administration to go too far on sanctions, because literally the Trump administration skimmed the milk in sanctions. They imposed all the sanctions on which the United States didn't have to pay too much. Because if Biden goes higher, for example, trying to turn Russia into another Iran and ban imports of Russian oil and gas, or if Biden tries to ban major state banks of the Russian Federation from operating in dollars, then economic, financial, and political risks for the US economy and for the international economy might appear to be too high for him. And since, as I said, he has many other issues to take care of, I don't think that he will be ready to pay the price to put Russia on its knees. He can do it, but the collateral damage will be significant. Therefore, my guess is that we will have more or less the same for another 4 years. And if we are thinking about real changes in the relationship, these changes, in my view, will come when we have a major generational change both in Russia and in the United States. And that might happen probably not earlier than 2024. Thank you.
Andrei, thanks so much, and also for opening up the importance of the sanctions issue and also pointing to the human rights dimension. My understanding from the Biden campaign is that the big values issue that they're going to push is anti-corruption, and they very much view global Magnitsky as part of that toolkit. So that's something to pay attention going forward. Next speaker is Dr. Maria Snegovaya, who is a visiting scholar at George Washington University, postdoctoral scholar at the PPE program at Virginia Tech, a political scientist with expertise in populism, but also a former journalist in Russia, again, brings expertise in both areas. Maria, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Alex. It's a big honor to be in such esteemed audience. So I will compliment our previous participants. I agree with most of what has been said, but want to provide a little bit more background on Russia and what Biden presidency may mean for US-Russia relations. So first of all, the Kremlin, who is Kremlin backing in this election? It's an interesting question, and it has been said it does not appear that, unlike 2016, in this particular election, the Kremlin officials have a particular preference. As a matter of fact, they've gone on record saying that the Russophobia in the US politics will continue no matter who is in power. And despite all the hopes that were into Trump's presidency back in 2016, he, from the Kremlin's viewpoint, did not deliver. As a matter of fact, the US politics on Russia during the Trump presidency has not at all been preferable from the Kremlin standpoint. One of the problems is, of course, is also that the current US-Russia administration under the US policy on Russia under Trump has been largely decided by the Congress. The Congress tried to constrain Trump, and as a result, some of the sanctions packages that were delivered were relatively serious. Now, this confusion that the Kremlin has is also revealed in its disinformation strategy. The RAND Corporation has recently issued a report that says that, like again 2016, in this election, Russia's disinformation targets both sides of the political spectrum, trying to infuel groups like Black Lives Matter and their supporters, on various human rights groups, on, for example, issues like police brutality, at the same time as the US nationalists on that actually portray Democrats as socialists or communists. So this confusion actually demonstrates that there is no one preferred side in this election. Ultimately, if you look at the polls and what the Russians think about this election, again, this is the same kind of division. Unlike 2016, in which the majority of Russians definitely favored Trump over Hillary Clinton, in this election, based on Levada September 2020 poll, Donald Trump leads with 16% as opposed to 9% of Russians who support Biden. That's just a reflection of how Russia's media covers this topic, right? And that again suggests that there is no one particular favorite. So given this analysis, what does it all mean for Biden's presidency? Essentially, is the Kremlin correct to assume that not much is going to change? I'm again inclined to agree, and I think this also follows what some of the participants have mentioned before me. There's definitely an advantage for the transatlantic alliance that comes with Biden's presidency, in that the rhetoric will become more conventional, and we're hoping that some US-Europe unity will be restored, and perhaps more consistent policy on Russia will be developed. But other than that, there is little that Biden administration is likely to do. First of all, part of the tensions between Trump's administration or the US and Europe under Trump's administration has come from Trump's push to increase NATO spending, to force the European countries to increase NATO spending, and to freeze the Nord Stream 2 project. In order to improve relationships with Europe, Biden administration essentially will be forced to abandon those two issues, or at least to soften the rhetoric on it. There's some sanctions that Biden promised in response to possible cyberspace attacks and corruption revelations, but again, as Andrei Kortunov has mentioned, it's unclear to what extent it will be willing to follow a relatively tougher stance on Russia when most of their low-hanging fruits have already been gathered. When it comes to the military interference, Biden, and we know his track record, given his previous service in Obama's administration, is relatively less hawkish than, for example, Hillary Clinton would be. As a matter of fact, it's known that under Obama administration, when he led Ukraine portfolio, he repeatedly resisted supplying defense weapons to Ukraine, and Javelins, for example, has not been sent to Ukraine until 2017 under Trump administration. Similarly, Biden is on record to oppose large US troops presence in Syria, and is likely will insist that only a very small, relatively small number of US troops is kept in Syria. He will also likely not pursue in any way removal of Assad. Again, potentially contrary to Hillary Clinton. In this sense, again, not fundamental change is unlikely to come. What I believe may be one of the most important issues for the Kremlin is Biden's stances of fracking and essentially shale oil and shale gas. We know that this issue has come up even during the debates between Trump and Biden, that Biden in the past has come on record that saying that he opposes fracking industry. But the huge development, very quick development of shale, production of shale oil and shale gas actually has significantly boosted the United States oil exports in the recent years, and as a matter of fact, the US has become the world leader in terms of oil production. Of course, this is one of the key factors that pushes oil prices down, at least to a certain global level, and that's a big concern for the Kremlin. As a matter of fact, the Kremlin largely missed the so-called shale revolution and doesn't have the capacity and technology essentially to significantly intensify its own industry in that department. If Biden was to essentially follow up on what he previously has suggested, then of course it will be it will be very, very beneficial for the Kremlin, since it will essentially potentially push the oil prices up. Ultimately, perhaps was mentioning Poland. We know the Trump administration was very friendly with Polish populist regime, and as a matter of fact, there was talks about increasing the US troops presence in Poland. It's unlikely that Biden will continue that track. As a matter of fact, it's very likely that there will be more tensions with the populist regimes of Orban and Little Justice in Poland, and as a result, this is again, it's unlikely that the Biden administration will pursue the same policy. It's more likely that the relationships with Germany will improve. Overall, just to sum it up, it's true that rhetorically, Biden is some kind of return to normalcy, to more conventional diplomacy and policy making. But in terms of substance, it's not very clear to what extent there will be a fundamental change from Biden's administration. Thank you.
Maria, thanks so much, especially for bringing up the question of Nord Stream sanctions, as well as, I think, for all this talk of transatlantic unity, the fact that you're looking at the possible rupture in relations with Poland and Hungary, or their downgrading, is somewhat of a complication that we haven't seen before in terms of the US-Europe relationship. Last but certainly not least, on our speaker list today, we go to Nicu Popescu, who is director of the Wider Europe program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And even though it's not in his bio, I'll also mention Nicu just did a stint as foreign minister of Moldova, where he had meetings both with the Russian side and the US side. So if anyone is poised to let us know how each side is thinking and what is likely to come, it's him. So Nicu, thanks again for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be on such a panel that is so consensual that it's rather reassuring about at least the second track of interaction between the US and Russia. I'll try to navigate around some things that I meant to say but were said, so I will try not to repeat. First of all, in order to look at the implications of what the future might bring us, I like to structure these things at the personal level effects of a presidency and the structural level. And I'd like to point a number of things. I think where the personality of the US president matters most often is for a number of high-profile, domestically relevant foreign policy issues. So, if you're Trump or Biden or Obama, might have a big influence on US policy on Israel or on Iran, possibly on nuclear stability issues. But actually, most issues in the world do not necessarily make it to the table of a US president. And some of these issues also include most of the countries that we deal with. They are, of course, related. So I'd point to a couple of structural elements of continuity, and we talk about things that might define continuity from Trump to Biden, but there are also things that have been there already during Obama times, right? NATO enlargement stopped already under Obama. NATO enlargement to Georgia and Ukraine de facto stopped. That's of course continued by Trump, and presumably I don't see a lot of desire to change that non-NATO enlargement into the post-Soviet space. The policy and the way the US conceives its relationship with China more or less stays the same from before Trump times. And so is US growing frustrations with European allies when it comes to burden sharing in NATO, defense spending, but also what you do around Europe in places like Libya, like Syria, like Ukraine, like Nagorno-Karabakh now. And all of it is going to stay. That started to be increasingly brutally expressed under Obama by Robert Gates. Maybe you remember his last speech at NATO. It's been done in a very impolite tweeted form by Trump, but that's a structural frustration that the Americans have with the EU, and that is also likely to stay. Another structural element that I see continuing is this basically US-Russian policy of mutual weakening. I think it's partly unintended, but nonetheless, it's there to stay. If you want, this recent T-suit strategy from the State Department put it with a different formula. It said, the US should try and run faster, and it should try and make Russia and China run more slowly. But that policy is probably going to stay. Now, the form it takes is, of course, US and European sanctions on Russia, which de facto have become a way to weaken Russia. I don't think it was the original purpose of that. The original purpose of those sanctions was to change policies on Donbass and Ukraine, but it has now turned into a way and the policy that has its effect, the longer term weakening of Russia. And of course, Russia is pursuing its own attempts to weaken the US. One of the most important ways Russia has been trying to do that is to basically frustrate and peel off the US alliance system. In recent days and weeks, it has been shockingly impressive the degree of patience with which the Russian leadership speaks of President Erdogan of Turkey, who is now involved in military action against a Russian ally, on whose soil a Russian ambassador has been killed, who has authorized the shooting down of a Russian plane. Now, imagine any EU member state doing a third of what Turkey did to Russia in recent years. Just imagine the kind of policy language we'd be hearing from the Russian leadership. But this amazing resilience in the face of Turkish behavior has multiple explanations, but one of it is this persistent attempt to weaken and peel off the US alliance system. That's also done through domestic political work in all kinds of countries, some of them being NATO member states, some of them being not necessarily in NATO, but nonetheless close to the US. I referred also to this personal level, but if I look, and presumably part of my role is to speak about the post-Soviet space, is that actually if you're Georgia or Moldova or Armenia, it doesn't matter that much who is the US president. In this decade, once the serious talk of NATO enlargement to the east stopped, the policy on these states is actually run by the US state apparatus, and there's a high degree of continuity. And, you know, to be frank, if I look at the details of US policies, it has not really changed under Trump, with the exception of Ukraine for reasons which are very special and peculiar. But now, you know, if we look ahead and we assume that Ukraine might not be a priority on a par with China and Iran and Russia, again, policy on Ukraine might go into being run by the higher and middle level of the US diplomatic service and ensure a good degree of continuity without the sparks that arose from Ukraine becoming enmeshed in US domestic politics. If I look at the future, how much time do I have? 2 minutes? Probably, yeah. You know, so I do see this policy of mutual weakening continuing, even if it wasn't intended, at least on the European and the US side, but it's there with much deeper roots. So one of the questions I have is, where do we see potential elements of self-restraint? I do see, for practical reasons, NATO no longer enlarging to the east. So policy support for countries like Ukraine, it's continuing, but it's not going through the roof when it comes to military assistance. What I do see is Russia having much less self-restraint. You know, the recent way, you know, the Europeans, for example, are completely afraid to engage in military and defense cooperation with a country like Ukraine and Georgia. Very few EU member states do that. And now we have Russia opening a military liaison office in Serbia, an EU candidate country. This is irking a lot of people. This is signaling a degree of lack of self-restraint that is accumulating. Of course, now you have Russian actions in the Central African Republic, in Libya. So the impression is that whereas, you know, self-control and self-restraint on several Russia-related issues, including in Ukraine, including on NATO enlargement to the east, has been internalized in US and European approaches. Even if diplomatic exchanges are not the nicest, these things are much more, you know, how not to irritate Russia seems to be much more seriously discussed in DC or all European capitals than it is being discussed in Moscow, where before you take some action in Libya or Serbia, I don't know if anyone at that table where decisions are taken is asking the question, guys, is this going to significantly complicate our interaction with the US and Berlin and Paris? And that is what I see one of these other elements which will keep the relationship for sure complicated. And this relationship will probably worsen before there is some kind of showdown which would instill, you know, greater self-restraint on both sides of this equation. I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thanks to everyone for keeping the time. And that gives us almost more than a half an hour now, like 35 minutes for question and answer. So I want to encourage the audience to use the Q&A feature of the webinar. If you're on Zoom, you can also list questions if you're watching on YouTube as well. I'm going to give people a little more chance to put questions in there and kick off with one of my own. My interests are often in the realm of domestic politics. And even though this is a foreign relations panel, I am, with so many experts here, I do want to push on something that came out of a number of the different, that were mentioned by a number of the different speakers, probably most prominently by Sam, but was a common theme throughout this, about Russia's different reaction to the presidential election, right? So we hear a couple things, like one, that Russia was, that the sort of official narrative in the Russian press was much less on one side than it was in 2016. Another, that maybe there may have been less activity by less Russian attempts to interfere in the US elections in this particular case. And Maria citing the the Rand report suggesting that it was back to this sort of exacerbating polarization, but less favoring one side or not. Time will tell on these things. I think I think caution is warranted at this point, both on the size of the effort and what the effort was at this point. But let's assume that kind of holds up. And then this idea that, you know, that it was less emotional, right? We've all seen a lot of the things that were around the 2016 elections. So what I want to do is just push you to go a little bit farther on this, which is why the difference? And I want to just put out like essentially three potential explanations, and would be interested in where any of the panelists, all the panelists would, or any of the panelists who want to comment on this, would stand on these three different potential explanations for the really different Russian response to 2016 versus 2020. And I could imagine, you know, if all this holds when we're writing these explanations of these in 6 months or a year from now. One would be, it really was personal about Hillary Clinton. Right? Like there is a story about Putin settling personal scores, that this was really personal about disliking Hillary Clinton, and now has retreated back to a sort of more measured policy. The second was, maybe did deterrence work? Right? There were these responses by the United States to, you know, we maligned the lack of responses by the Trump administration, but the Trump administration got overruled by this. It's like the one thing Congress was unanimously rolling the Trump administration on was like sanctions and protecting Trump from giving Mike McFaul to the Russians, right? Like, so did deterrence work? Did Russia look back on what happened after 2016 and think this isn't worth it to get involved in this kind of thing in 2020? Or was it that the promise of Trump turned out to be less glamorous than the reality of Trump turned out to be much less glamorous than the promise of Trump, that there was all these speculation of all these great things that having a Trump presidency would do for Russia. And maybe, as Sam was saying before, you know, that it was the unpredictability of it was actually ended up being more of a headache. So I would love to hear more from all of you. Maybe I'll toss it first, as we can go, you know, whoever wants to answer this, but we could start with Sam and then Victoria, if you want to go, and Maria, if you want to jump in.
Sure. I mean, thanks for the question. I mean, I think I'm not really sure it's any of those three things, right? If it is one, it's probably closest to the third. But I think that, I mean, it kind of depends on what your theory of what happened in 2016 was, right? So I'm not of the school of thought that thinks that there was a plan, you know, hatched somewhere in the presidential administration to somehow change the outcome of the election. I think there were a lot of sort of actors in various places in the system, some, you know, probably within GRU, some acting outside, people like Prigozhin, right, who, you know, are entrepreneurs. Even if they're in the system, they're entrepreneurs, right? They're trying to demonstrate they can do something useful. And so you had people sort of experimenting, and they were getting a lot of traction. They were getting a lot of traction for reasons that were intrinsic to the election in 2016. We've seen the differences between the election itself in 2016 to 2020. Had a lot more swing voters in 2016. There were more people who could be moved. There were more areas you could insert yourselves into, whereas opinions in this election were a lot more fixed, and I think just a lot harder to manipulate. So it may have been that there were plenty of people still trying to sort of earn this paycheck from the Kremlin, but who couldn't get the same kind of traction. But again, I don't think that the Kremlin was under any illusion in 2016 that they were going to put Trump in the White House. I don't think anybody thought that Trump was going to get into the White House, including probably Trump himself. And so it was, you know, playing around the margins, trying to maybe make life a little bit more difficult for Hillary, maybe, but also to demonstrate, you know, that they've got this, there's all these things they can do around the world, right? They can interfere in Ukraine, they can get it in Syria, right? Oh, and they can play this electoral interference game too, right? In a way that, of course, they think we've been doing around the world as well. And so they didn't have that point to prove anymore. But also Russian politics have shifted, right? You know, in 2016, Putin was still ticking along at 85-something%, you know, approval ratings, at least officially. We're well below that now, right? He's got problems he's got to solve domestically. There's less money in the system. So I think just attention has been elsewhere. And I think that sort of the risk-reward calculation is probably a bit different as well, again, for the reasons you already mentioned. So.
Sam, super quick follow-up. So I was also kind of asking about the mass response, which tended to be this kind of enthusiasm for Trump. Are you suggesting that was actually kind of just a function of what was coming out of the regime, and the regime has been a bit different this time around for all the reasons you said? Or is there also a souring on the part of the Russian population on Trump?
Well, so I mean, here's the thing, with Russian state television in particular, we talk about as being tightly controlled. But it's tightly controlled when there is a command, right? When there's an order. When there isn't, right, it goes off in all kinds of different directions and has conversations that are more or less, I mean, they toe the line, right, but they're more or less open, right? So in 2016, there was clearly an instruction that said, let's do as much damage as we can to Hillary, right, and let's, support this Trump guy. It's a lot of fun. We can make a lot of noise about it, right? And that certainly worked, and that shaped opinion. So you were getting all kinds of sort of weird, almost, quasi-religious sentiment towards Trump, right? Which there was clearly not that order given this time around, and so you saw a lot more diversity in the conversation about the election this time. Plus, I think genuinely, as you were saying, there's some buyer's remorse, right? Having put Trump in the White House, now you've got to live with this guy for 4 years, and do you really want him again for another 4 years? The honeymoon's over.
Great, Victoria, did you want to weigh in on that as well?
I think that the main reason is the disappointment about Trump. He was too much vocal about supporting Russia and about forming a new dialogue with Russia, etc., and promising a lot. But in fact, it was understandable 4 years ago for experts that it is impossible, because the president is not alone in American domestic policy and American system. He's not a figure who can decide everything. But it wasn't understandable for the people, maybe, and for some I would say, for some politicians. But after 4 years, Trump being in White House with all these, with all his steps with sanctions, it is absolutely clear now for both for Russia society and for Russian politicians that we shouldn't expect something from American president. So the first thing, disappointment, and the second one, it's the low expectation in general about possibility of improvement of Russian-American relations. So I think it is common thing now for Russian elite that we cannot change something. For the nearest future, there is bipartisan compromise on Russian politics in United States, and we should wait for any, I don't know, for something that something changes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Victoria and Sam, on that one. We've got a lot of great questions in the queue right now. They're sort of bundling in sort of two main areas. So I want to start one having to do more with Europe and NATO, and one having to do with other areas. So I want to start by asking, we've got one question about whether the Biden administration is going to change anything with relations to Central Asia. And then another one, which is just a sort of slight follow-up on that, which has to do with a slight follow-up on the discussion we've had already on Ukraine, but in Crimea specifically. Will there be any change in terms of policy towards Crimea? So Andrei or Maria, do you guys want to take first crack at this? Like, anything changes in Central Asia, anything around Crimea?
Well, if I might, I think that Central Asia is not likely to be a major item on the Biden's administration agenda. Central Asia is important as long as the United States is present in Afghanistan. So with the US withdrawal, I think the relative importance of this region is likely to go down. I think Biden might be more critical than Trump of the Central Asian authoritarianism, but it does not really mean too much, because the United States does not have a lot of instruments to influence political developments in the region. It's likely that Central Asia will be perceived not only through will be looked at not only through the Russian lens, but also through the Chinese lens. And of course, the United States is likely to remain concerned about the Chinese advances in Central Asia, about One Belt and One Road projects. But again, it's not likely to be a top priority. And I can imagine a little bit more support for the liberal opposition in Central Asia, maybe more funds that are supposed to be used for advancing the US political system, maybe more investment into education, but not much. On Crimea, I think that President Trump has not changed the US policy on Crimea, though he threatened he would do it back in 2016. Frankly, I don't think that the United States is likely to be more involved in Ukraine on the formal level. I don't think that Biden will be eager to join the Normandy group, but sanctions will be there. Again, it's hard to see how he can make the US position on Crimea tougher than it is right now. It's not likely that he will introduce additional sanctions. Of course, if we have escalation in Donbass, Biden might initiate new sanctions and new mechanisms of pressure on Russia. But I think that Donbass will be the first item, Crimea will be the second.
Sorry, Maria. We also have a question as well that just came in about the possible implications for the conflict in the South Caucasus, in particular between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So feel free to weigh in on any of the other ones too, on Central Asia or Crimea, but we'll just expand this a little bit more, and then I'm going to shift the focus to a little bit of discussion about Europe.
Thanks a lot, Josh. Yeah, so first of all, on Crimea, we know, as I said before, Biden did lead the Ukrainian portfolio under Obama, right? So we know already how he was on Crimea. He was among the people to actually caution the Obama administration about possible implication of any serious engagement with the conflict, and this is likely to continue. So I do not necessarily expect any serious engagement as well. It probably will be also true of the North Caucasus, the Caucasus, I'm sorry, of the Armenia and Azerbaijan situation, where there will be probably the right rhetoric and the emphasis on the human rights. But I would not necessarily expect any serious US engagements, particularly given how deep the domestic issues are at the moment. They're likely to take more of his attention. A very interesting question, talking not about Central Asia, but Asia more broadly, is whether the Trans-Pacific Partnership will be revived. Just a reminder that it was the Obama project that unfortunately Trump ended, and is actually potentially a serious blow to China. I have read a lot on this topic, and the results is very contradictory. So some scholars say Biden will absolutely renew the project. Others say he will not continue. But I think it's one of the key questions about his Asia policy in general. If it's likely to be bolder, then I would expect the Trans-Pacific Partnership to renew. But there is not so far any clarity. And just very briefly, Josh, I wanted to follow up on your question about why the difference in Russia behavior in 2016-2020. I wanted to agree with previous speakers who emphasized the third issue, that Trump did not deliver. And I wanted to say that's a very interesting question, since the Kremlin had reasons to expect Trump to deliver, right? The Kremlin is very friendly with these populist nationalist regimes like Orban or Kaczynski in Poland. For some reason, Trump did not deliver, and that I think is very interesting study, question for investigation to scholars. One possible answer is that Trump, like looking at the variety of populists, and here I'm going to my scholarly interests, Trump may not appear to be a classical illiberal populist as much as technocratic or populist like Babiš in the Czech Republic, where the emphasis is more on business sort of deals rather than specific like ideological changes that we've seen in Hungary and Poland. And Trump, being this sort of technocratic populist leader, viewing politics in terms of business transaction, just had to follow eventually the US interest. And his policy, as I mentioned before, has not been pro-Kremlin most of the time. But very briefly, I want to mention your second point, George. Did the Russians learn the lesson? Are they likely now to be deterred? I do not think the Kremlin has shown a lot of willingness to learn, unfortunately. In the recent years, and the Navalny poisoning, if anything, has just demonstrated that the Kremlin is not learning fast enough. And that's something for us to keep in mind in the future.
Thanks so much, Maria. I want to shift the focus now a little bit to Europe, and maybe I'll put this question first to Nicu. With the sort of idea that Andrei has put out in the discussion, and that's been sort of confirmed, that Russia is not likely to be high on the list of U.S. foreign policy priorities, and that even says the question of whether foreign policy is going to be prioritized over domestic politics, especially in the near term. So do you think that but the return of Biden, if it's a Biden administration, the return of a more normalcy in how the U.S. relates to its traditional allies in Europe, does that open up the possibility that Europe will take more of a lead in kind of managing relations with Russia? So sort of Western relations with Russia will be more managed by Europe than they have been previously?
Well, a couple of things. There is this question about Russian elections interference in the US. And, one thing I would like to point is that, of course, presumably there's less of it this time, but at this stage, 4 years ago, we didn't know as much as we did know in December 2016, and let alone in January 2017. So that's one thing. The second thing is that I think the election interference in the US was somewhat different, partly because if you ask me, there's already so much money in the US electoral system that money from outside are sometimes less needed than in the politics of many European countries. And you have all of this stream of videos and leaks, with Austrian political parties, loans to French political parties. Now you have a series of investigations from the Dossier Center on cash flows and political consultants and business opportunities for Georgia, for Armenia, for Moldova. So election kind of, building building friendships in domestic politics, and I put it entre guillemets, and I use this as a euphemism for what is happening, remains a visible systematic policy that we see constantly re-emerging in a lot of European states. Some of them are in NATO, some of them are not. Some of them are in the Balkans. That happens, every year we have 2-3 credible, documented proofs, basically, of that. So that's why I want to draw your attention that no, it's a bit too early to say that, 2016 was a one-off and now we're down to great powers mutually respecting each other's domestic political process. And, we're seeing a happy end to that anomaly that is not just Trump, but also, dysfunctional election process. Whether the EU will take the lead on this, I doubt it. For now, the debate in Europe is a bit different. Some of this debate was related to this idea that Europe should build a strategic autonomy or, sovereignty, capacity to act and do things it wants to do either without the US or sometimes against the US, if needed. Also on issues like doing business and, respecting the JCPOA with Iran. It's not just Russia. A lot of it is not about Russia. Or in decided to look for a middle way on 5G and Huawei. So there was this conversation. Of course, someone like Trump was putting a lot of fire behind this conversation. Now, the alternative conversation to that is that everyone got scared a bit, but why a Trump second presidency might mean for the transatlantic alliance, and with Biden hopefully in the White House, the conversation is how can the Europeans propose a new and credible burden sharing to the US, where the EU does more in crucial foreign policy issues and crises, but that's not yet taking over leadership on big geopolitical matters like Russia. So we'll see now a push from the Europeans to do more on foreign policy dossiers that matter to the US and to the EU. maybe more leadership on some issues, but I don't see the Europeans yet either being united or having the weight to really substitute the absolute centrality of the US in a lot of conversations that NATO has with Russia.
Perfect. So one question I would like panel to consider, something that's come up in the Q&A from a number of sources, is the question of China. We've seen a real dialing up of the heat from this administration in sort of positing China as the main strategic competitor. Of course, in this national security strategy, we have both China and Russia singled out as great power competitors, but it's been clear that there's been attempts to sort of push decoupling, a number of domestic sort of issues associated with China, Chinese students and so forth, knowledge institutes and so forth, as well as the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. So all of this is dialed up. There is a prevailing kind of wisdom or view out there that possibly Russia could be brought in to be the kind of swing power in this strategic competition. So I don't know if you want to address the latter, but in general, how do you view the Chinese factor as complicating or mediating U.S.-Russia relations going forward? Andrei, I know you've written a bit about this, so maybe we'll go to you first on this topic.
Well, to some extent, I think Biden might be very different from Trump in this particular aspect. If you follow the discussion within the Democratic Party about Russia and China, and within think tanks which are close to the Democratic Party, or even statements by Biden himself, he basically argued a couple of times that China remains the strategic competitor of the United States, a kind of peer competitor of America, while Russia is something like a big rogue state. It's a foe rather than a competitor. So Trump tried to repeat Henry Kissinger, to work with a weaker adversary in order to confront the strong adversary. I think that in theory you can imagine that Biden would like to become Kissinger in reverse, or anti-Kissinger, to cut a deal with a stronger competitor and to have some accommodation with Beijing and to focus on pushing the weaker competitor, Russia, harder. I think that that is tempting, because I think that in the DC establishment, Russia is perceived as much more a convenient enemy than China for a variety of reasons that we can discuss. Though I don't think that it is practical. I don't think that Biden can break, this partnership between China and Russia. It is important for both sides. I don't think that Biden will be in a position to find some accommodation with China. He can still, I think, reach a trade agreement with China, but I don't think it will stop geopolitical and technological and other rivalries between the two countries. Of course, I think that definitely there are limits for this administration to push Moscow in the corner. So having said that, I think that there'll be attempts to find some accommodation with China, and maybe indeed Biden will try to play this game of Kissinger in reverse. I think it will not work, but who knows? He might try doing that. And finally, of course, I don't think that Biden will try to bring Russia to the right side of history against China. I don't think that anyone in the surroundings, in the environment of the future Biden administration considers this to be possible, desirable, or even in U.S. interests.
Thanks so much. Victoria, is there something you'd like to add to that about China? And then especially you have gotten a specific question in the chat about your Cold War analogy and whether you see Cold War. If that's the case, what is the potential of a split between Russia and China, especially given that they seem to agree on a lot of these international order issues that you have identified before as being sort of a real common element to this relationship?
Actually, I absolutely agree with Professor Kortunov. I think that Biden would try to make American relation with China more friendly, and would try to change this the Trump aggressive policy towards China, and Russia will stay the main focus or the main enemy, I would say, like this. So because I think that it is understandable that it is absolutely impossible for United States to have two enemies at once, both China and Russia. So they need to, I don't know, to make it in first China, then Russia, or first Russia, then China, something like this. So this time it will be China time for United States with Biden, and not Russia time. And as for Cold War, I would say that I think that Cold War, it was a specific historical period with its specific characteristics. And even if now we have conflict in Russian-American relation, we should not take this name of the different period, of different historic situation to name this period in Russian-American relations. I don't think that we are in Cold War, and I don't think that we will be in Cold War, because the reality changed very much. Global reality and a reality in both in United States and in Russia. The problem is that we still have in our model of bilateral relation, we still have this limits of Cold War images of each other, and we still have this Cold War generation in political elite, and we still have this psychology of Cold War in political elite and in understanding each other. And to change the model, we need to change these images. We need to go out from them, to create new one. And this is the main problem, I think, for bilateral relations.
Great. We got a couple questions here that I want to combine and maybe get some comments from, maybe this will lead us into sort of towards the wrap up. We've got about 8 minutes left here. We have a question from another ex-Moldovan government official, Vlad Lupan, who's on here, who gives a very nice link to our last panel. So on our last panel we did last month, we had people from the two different letters that had been written on what U.S. policy towards Russia should be. And one of the things that came out of it was a sort of distinction between a more normative and a type approach where Russia, improved relations for Russia are based on conditionality of Russia following rule of law, like Alex was saying before, more activity around corruption, democracy, these kind of preconditions to better U.S.-Russian relations, the sort of normative view of it, and then the pragmatic view of it, which is about getting whatever is possible. And so the question is if we find people in a coming in Biden administration who are more committed to this kind of normative approach, is that going to sort of play into sort of Putin's domestic claim that Russia is surrounded by enemies and that everybody needs to rally around Putin again? And what will be the consequences of that? So some sort of sense of where do you think this is going to go? Like, is the idea that under the Biden administration, we're going to go back to this kind of more normatively driven foreign policy, or is it going to be still opportunities for pragmatic cooperation? And then William Courtney adds, that, and putting a little meat on this question from Vlad, that the U.S. has criticized Russia for malign activities and Russia has criticized U.S. actions, such as in the near abroad. So as long as there continue to be these flashpoints of contention, like, can you get meaningful change in U.S.-Russian or even meaningful dialogue? Is it possible under the current circumstances? Or do these areas of concern where the countries are, sort of pushing back and forth at each other, do those need to be resolved first before we can even get to dialogue? So maybe we've got, that maybe this question can take us out if people want to answer. Maybe we'll go in the order we would make this an answer to this question as well as sort of towards a closing statement here. We can go in the order we originally went. So Sam?
Sure. I mean, look, to a certain extent, I'm not sure I accept the premise of the question, right? But I think that if what we've seen, right, has been that, administrations that come in wanting to be pragmatic have ended up having to moralize, and administrations that came in, wanting to be moralizing have then ended up doing mostly pragmatic things. It was the Obama administration, that pressed Russia on its position and its values in the world, but then it ended up doing New START, right? It was, the Bush administration that sort of went to a large extent in the other direction, but largely because of what the interests were as they were seen from Washington, right? So all of a sudden, you had an administration under Bush and then under Trump again that was in a treaty busting mode. You had an Obama administration that was not, right? But that was driven really by Washington's interests. I think at this point, if we take a clear-eyed view of Moscow's interest, and Moscow's interest is to be able to keep governing the country the way it wants to govern the country indefinitely. From that perspective, it sees NATO expansion and EU expansion both as a threat, right? It hems in its room for maneuverability, it puts increasing pressure on the Russian political and economic system. And so it becomes a question of, not what we're going to ask, Moscow to do, right? But what we ourselves and the Europeans here are critical, right? Want to do, right? Is it important for Europe to continue, pushing into the Eastern neighborhood? Is it important for Europe and NATO to continue pushing into the Western Balkans? Or is it not? If it is, right, then you're going to have to defend lines and push through lines on the map of Europe, and that's going to make relations with Moscow more difficult, right? Otherwise, right, if we don't have those interests, then things can be fairly straightforward, and we can concentrate on strategic security and arms control, and sort of continue more or less ignoring Russia. And I'll probably stop there.
Thanks, Sam. Victoria?
I think it's a little bit a mistake to think that the harder someone push on Russia, the better Russia will behave itself. I think there is no such fact for Russian foreign policy as outside aggressive pushing. Even more, the more you push on Russia, the more Russia will focus on being on this feeling being in the circle of enemies, and trying to find some way out of it. And this way out could be not very pleasant for outsiders. It's like this. I think it's something in Russian identity. You cannot push on Russia. It's a fact. I think, and the one thing that I would add, that there is real fear in Russia that Biden would be more too much focused on these issues of human rights, etc., and he wouldn't be with this focus. He wouldn't be open to the question that could have a dialogue between Russia and United States. And there is only one issue for the dialogue. It is security agenda. And for Russia, it would be ideal that Biden would forget about human rights and just focus on security agenda. But this is the problem with Russian-American relations. What would be ideal for Russia, it's not ideal for United States, and vice versa. So I would say that we should understand that for United States, it's always very important, this liberal agenda, this idea of democracy and of promoting this idea of democracy. And it would be better for Russia to just to calm down about it. It's just a part of American identity and of American foreign policy mission. So why be so nervous about it? Just let us be calm and discuss real questions.
Great, thank you so much. Andrei.
Max Weber, a famous sociologist, the father of sociology, wrote an interesting piece on ethics. And he distinguishes between two types of ethics. The ethics of principle and the ethics of responsibility. The ethics of principle implies that you stand by your values no matter what. The ethics of responsibility implies that you should first think about possible repercussions and consequences of your actions, and only then you take these actions. I think that there'll be never an ideal balance between these two. My personal take is that statespeople should think probably more than individuals about the ethics of responsibility, because their responsibility is high. Now, you mentioned the two letters, and I think that my comment to the two letters is that talking to Russia might be difficult, it might be unpleasant, might be very frustrating, but it shouldn't be regarded as a reward for good behavior. I think a dialogue is still important, even if the sides disagree, even if the dialogue is disappointing. And I think that definitely if Biden is able to restore the dialogue, it does mean that he is yielding to Putin, that he is ready to approve, quote unquote, the Russian policy. And one more point that I'd like to make here is that it might lead us into another discussion, but I think that the reality is that the political transition in Russia has already started this year. And definitely that creates new limitations, but also new opportunities. It means that the West should be very careful in trying to deal with potential constituencies of stakeholders in Russia. There are some, and I think that their importance might increase in years to come. I think that we cannot predict how it will play out, but definitely the country is changing. And I think that if in the United States, 2024 will mean a major generational change, it will mean also a major generational change in the Russian leadership. And we should always keep this perspective in mind. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrei. I'll note that much like the U.S. election, we're going a little bit longer than people might have thought, but I hope we remain compelling and gripping entertainment as well. To discuss these issues, but I do want to give our last two panelists a chance to weigh in as well. So thanks to all of you for sticking with us just a little bit longer today. Maria?
Thanks a lot, Josh. I'll be quick. I think it's a common misconception in the US that the way the Russians view the United States is fundamentally shaped by the US policies towards Russia. Just a reminder that the Kremlin still controls main TV channels, which remain the key information source for the majority of the Russian population, although in the recent years the trend has been changing very interestingly. More and more Russians, particularly younger groups, rely on the internet as key for the main information. And as such, the Kremlin is able to manipulate the reality in the vision of the United States by the Russians in the way it's willing to, when it's convenient. In the recent years, we've seen, for example, the relations worsen as a result of war in Georgia, where, as a matter of fact, the United States has very little to do. But the visions of Russians of the United States has dramatically declined. Some happened after the war with Ukraine. There, you can argue maybe the United States was engaged, but it followed the reset, which was actually intentional policy by Obama administration to improve relations with Russia. Honestly, I would argue that ultimately this is still under complete control of the Kremlin, and the United States should therefore be relatively free to pursue a normative approach towards Russia, because ultimately the Kremlin will manipulate eventually the perceptions of the external situation in the eyes of Russians. And I wanted also to mention that my own analysis does not confirm the fact that Russians will never give up, as Victoria has mentioned. In particular, Russians are quite responsive. The perception of foreign policy and Russia's goals on the international stage change dramatically depending on a number of issues. One of them is economic situation domestically. My own experimental study of Russia's attitudes has shown that when Russians see that Russia's domestic situation as being unfavorable, they actually tend to decrease their willingness to engage in international conflicts, much like the Americans do. In this sense, the Russians are quite rational. They just, when there's a lot of domestic issues, they don't think the Kremlin should really engage a lot outside of the country. And in the recent years, I would argue this has increasingly constrained the Kremlin's ability to act aggressively on the international stage, as it did, for example, back in 2014. From this perspective, I would argue that sanctions on Russia that aim as part to decrease, to refocus the attention of Russian population on domestic issues may eventually end up being quite effective in shifting the focus from aggressive international policy on domestic issues. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Maria. Nico, the final word?
Yes, I'll have to be pessimistic at the end. A couple of things. So it's true that pressure on Russia is seen as not yielding in the short term good outcomes for the West. But the problem is that trying to reset with relations with Russia hasn't worked greatly either. We had Obama, we had Meseberg, we had the selective engagement offer of the EU in 2016, and we had the French initiative last year, and none of them actually really helped unblock relations. So pressure doesn't work, resets doesn't work. These are sides of the two coins. Two, if I go back to Munich's Putin speech, half of his complaints have been solved by the West. The West is less interventionist. Obama was less interventionist than Bush, Trump less interventionist than Obama. Human rights, I'm sorry, but Chirac was more impolite to Putin during press conferences over Chechnya than Merkel ever was, or Macron ever was. There's much fewer complaints about human rights and democracy in Russia than 20 years ago and than 15 years ago. So on several of these issues, NATO is no longer, de facto is no longer enlarging to the east. So half of Munich's speech is now accomplished. Half of the complaints of that speech are no longer valid. And the political relationship has been going from bad to worse. And that's something we should reflect upon. Now, I think this idea that, unfortunately, that less conflict generates more dialogue is something that we think here in this wonderful white-collar panel. If I look at the world, I see more conflict generating more dialogue. Turkey goes into Libya, Turkey gets into Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Russia sends people and advisors to the Central African Republic and to Libya, and then everyone wants to have, Russia has more dialogue because of getting involved in Libya and in Syria with the Middle East, with the Saudis. Once Russia got into the Central African Republic, suddenly France wants to have a dialogue with Russia on Africa, which was unimaginable for Paris 5 years ago. So unfortunately, the logic that less conflict leads to more dialogue is not something that drives the foreign policy of all the states. And that is why I don't know what's the outcome of that, but it's not that we try to eliminate points of friction and hopefully we'll get somewhere better. That's not how all the states behave in this context.
Thank you so much, Nicu. And I want to now just take this opportunity on behalf of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU, as well as the New York City Russia Public Policy Series, to thank all of our panelists today. This was incredibly informative, and just also like the way that we had a big debate internally about whether to do this Friday or next Friday. And we said, well, we should definitely do, we wanted to go with the closer one, but that might put some stress on our panelists if, we don't have clear results beforehand. So I really, really want to appreciate, say a word of appreciation for everyone preparing for this panel in what has been a fairly uncertain time in the aftermath of the elections. But I know I found it enormously useful and informative to learn from this. So just a big thanks to everybody. A shout out that our next New York City Russia Public Policy series will be on December 8th. We're going to be talking about events in Belarus, and we'll have more information to all of you then, but you can look for information about that at the Jordan Center website and the Harriman Institute website. Alex?
Thanks so much. Also a big thank you to the panelists. We'll see you next time. And, you know, is Marlene available to sort of close us out for us? And thank you again to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for supporting all of this work.
And the same, once again, also thank you from PONARS-Eurasia for this really great discussion. I think everybody enjoy your nuances in not having a kind of black and white Manichaean look at both sides and giving us all the subtleties and the nuances of all these complex issues. So thanks again.